everyone.
Good evening.
My name is Elizabeth Quiroz. I'm the program administrator at the Bioethics Institute, and I'll be moderating this evening's program. Tonight, the Bioethics Institute of Loyola Marymount University is pleased to bring Professor John Evans to our campus to discuss the promise of a more democratic bioethics debate for our polarized times. Professor Evans' presentation will be followed by a brief response from the director of LMU's Bioethics Institute, Professor Roberto Deloro, and then the discussion will be open to the audience for questions and answers. We will formally end this evening's discussion at 8:30, after which all are invited to enjoy a wine and cheese reception in the atrium. Before we begin, allow me to introduce our featured speaker. Dr. John Evans is a professor of sociology at the University of California, San Diego, who earned his BA from Macalester College and his Ph.D. from Princeton. He has been a postdoctoral fellow at Yale, a visiting member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, and has held visiting professorial fellowships at the University of Edinburgh and the University of Munster. His most recent book, titled The History and Future of Bioethics, A Sociological View, uses sociological reasoning to examine the history of bioethics and offers a solution to what he sees as the crisis in the bioethics debate. His previous books include Playing God, Human Genetic Engineering and the Rationalization of Public Bioethical Debate, which won the Distinguished Book Award from the Religion section of the American Sociological Association, and another book, Contested Reproduction, Genetic Technologies, Religion, and Public Debate, which examines how ordinary religious people in the US talk about reproductive genetic technologies. In addition to these books, Evans has written over 35 articles and book chapters on topics in religion, culture, politics, and science. In this evening's presentation, Professor Evans will describe the history of the bioethical debate in the US, its polarization and disconnection from the American public, and ultimately put forward a proposal for making the bioethical debate more accountable to the public's views. It's a great honor to have him here with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Professor John Evans.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. Can people hear me okay? So can one of our technical people look into that situation for us? That'd be great. In the meantime, I'll just speak louder. Okay. Well, this is my first slide. I should say a couple of years ago, I used to have $250,000 written across the side of there. You know, it's one of our prime buildings on campus, and the joke was, in the time of California crisis, it was for sale to make a little money for the University of California. But we no longer talk that way in the University of California. We're now optimistic and hopeful. But thank you very much. It's an honor to be asked to come to give the 2014 bioethics lecture here at Loyola Marymount. And thanks to Roberto for extending me this invitation. So my style is to tell you what I'm going to say it, and then tell you again. This is sort of standard sociology thing. So here's what I'm going to say. And whenever you see red, that means that's where I am. So if you just had dinner and you sort of check out and you want to check back in, red is where we are. So we won't lose you for good. So let me start actually with a story. About 20 years ago, I was finishing my PhD, writing a dissertation about how bioethics debate works. And I was invited to be part of a discussion group at a bioethics think tank called the Hastings Center, where we were talking about whether we should be able to patent human genes. The Hastings Center at the time was known for, and still is known as, a place that tries to bring people with diverse views together to talk about bioethical issues. And after this long day of discussion, we were put in a van to go to this hotel, and I sat next to a theologian from a tradition far from my own. In fact, in my upbringing, this person was like the religious other, what my religious group was defined as not being, basically. And in the van, he told me his theological position on the human body, and my conclusion was, wow, that's really weird, okay? And in contemporary terms, that's like being a person who watches Fox News being forced to watch MSNBC in an airport waiting area. However, in the subsequent years, I would not say I ever adopted his view, but it influenced me. I came to appreciate some of what he said as insightful about the human condition, and it changed my views to some extent. So, this is what is supposed to happen in liberal democratic societies like the US. The idea is that people discuss things with their fellow citizens, come to some modicum of agreement, or at least enough agreement to live together in the same place and to create laws that are going to apply to everybody. However, there is a breakdown in American society, and it's most evident in our political system. You can show with studies, sociological studies, that people are actually not polarizing on their opinions on social issues, except if it becomes defined as a political issue. Then there's this almost perfect divergence going on. This is most obviously evident if you look at congressional voting behavior, which is now essentially a perfect party line vote every single time. So this is also evident in the media, where people who talk on Fox News and MSNBC seem to have no common perceptions about reality from which they could even begin to talk. People are being sorted into their own communicative bubbles by their politics, where a liberal never has to encounter a conservative argument being taken seriously, and a conservative never has to encounter a liberal argument being taken seriously. This is simply exacerbated by the internet. But it wasn't always this way. Before cable television fractured the viewing audience into self-selecting factions, there was essentially one shared news program, which was the indistinguishable CBS, NBC, ABC News, if people remember this era. And yes, there was PBS on the station, but I'll stick with my analogy for now. Now, it could be said that CBS, NBC, ABC News was itself biased and unrepresentative of the public. But everyone was part of the same conversation. Newspapers, which those things that people used to read, the paper things, they were similar. For most papers, non-local content came from UPI or AP, from a sort of a unified source. Now people get their news, young people I hear now get their news from Jon Stewart, is the primary source of news for many people, and other people, other sources. So, I will describe bioethical debate in a minute, but I would like to say that it's now like Fox News versus MSNBC. And I would like to make it like CBS, NBC, ABC News, in that there is one conversation going on, but I want to incorporate all views. I want to make it like a news show where one day you get Fox, the next day you get MSNBC. A public bioethics that considers how all the people in the US talk about their values. So it's my view that if everyone in America, for example, is allowed to vote, then everyone's values should be represented in institutions that exist to give ethical advice to our elected decision makers. So in what follows, I'm going to complain that the liberal perspective is in control of public bioethics. And I don't say this because I want the conservative perspective to then take over. Rather, I think that liberals have long advocated the health of the democracy, even if this means harming their short-run interests by empowering their opposition. So for example, if liberals could create voter registration laws that would reduce the number of conservatives who are allowed to vote, I don't think they would do it, because they have a fundamental interest in democracy. It's never been the position of the liberal perspective that you had to burn Rome in order to save it. So, I will be focusing on one slice of our politics, which is the debate about issues having to do with science, medicine, and the human body. These have come to be called bioethical issues. And science is generating all sorts of conundrums for us that force us to debate what, as a society, we want to do. We could just start with a few of these. Shall we allow people to clone themselves? What should be the criteria to decide who gets a liver transplant, given that there are not enough livers for everyone who needs them? How do you know when someone is dead, so that their liver could be given to someone else, for example? The person down the hill from me at UCSD is starting human trials of putting stem cells in paralyzed people's spines to see if it can regain some function. Is that a good idea? Or people can already decide that their children can have certain traits, mostly conditions that people would universally consider to be diseases. But should people be allowed to pick the color of their children's hair? Should people who value something that the rest of us consider to be a deficiency be allowed to design that into your children? So there are people who have genetic forms of deafness who want to ensure that their children will be deaf. A child can now have 3 genetic parents, 2 sources for the nucleus, a mother and a father, and a separate source for the mitochondrial DNA. Is that okay? And I could go on and on with this, but people read the newspaper, those paper things that we used to watch, or those of you who watch TV, will be able to identify endless debates like this. Well, with these debates about the body, I should add, I'm not talking about debates that have come to be seen as your private choice. I'm not talking today about whether you, if given the opportunity, should genetically enhance your child. That's an ethical question of great importance, but that's not what I'm talking about. In a liberal democratic society, anything we do not regulate becomes a matter of your own ethical choice. So, for example, for good or bad, in the US, essentially in vitro fertilization is not regulated at all, with the exception of safety and efficacy. Unlike the UK, where there's centralized government decision-making about whether or not you can do certain forms of reproductive genetic technology. So if society is allowing you to make a decision, you need to look to the moral ethical community you're in for guidance. I mean, to take the obvious example here at LMU, if you're Catholic, the Catholic Church has many ethical insights for you to use in your decision. But I'm not talking about that tonight. Similarly, I'm not talking about bioethics consultation in hospitals about issues as whether life support should be ended for a comatose person in this particular situation. Again, that's typically a negotiated choice between family and physicians within the fact that this choice exists is an already settled area of public law. However, this bioethics debate changes when we're talking about policy that will be forced on everyone in a pluralistic democracy where there are many religions and many ethical communities. So my talk tonight is about how we, as a pluralistic democratic society, should make ethical policy about these bioethical issues. So we all have all these collective bioethical conundrums to decide what to do with. In a liberal democratic society, we should look to our elected officials to make such a decision. And so how do we actually do this? So I know everyone here has great faith in the incredible wisdom of their members of Congress. So if polls are true, people have a very dim view of their elected officials. But in their defense, they cannot be expected to be an expert on absolutely everything. Okay? I think we can agree, I don't know whose house district I'm standing in right now, but I'm willing to bet that they do not have a Ph.D. in philosophy or theology, and they're not an expert on these sorts of issues. So what are we going to do? So the government has, for many decades now, relied upon the field that I will call public bioethics to give advice. The people in this field are mostly academics. They write articles, books, and so on about ethical stance we as a people, as a collective, should take towards a technological innovation having to do with the body. The most clear-cut example of this is the Government Ethics Commission, of which every presidential administration typically has one and has had one since the Nixon era. But it also includes people who are writing on a topic trying to influence ethical policy through any other venue. So one example is in the mid-90s, does everyone remember Dolly the cloned sheep? Mm-hmm. So we create Dolly, this Scottish fellow creates Dolly the cloned sheep. There's this instant fury about whether or not this technology could be used to clone human beings. The public was very interested in regulation of some sort, and President Clinton assigned the existing government Public Bioethics Commission to examine the question and make ethical recommendations to the administration for some sort of policy response. One of the concerns in the media at the time was that famous evil people could be cloned. So I do believe it was an extremely useful bit of advice to Congress to let them know that, if you cloned Hitler, you would end up with a baby that looked like Hitler, but it doesn't mean its DNA would allow it to take control of a country in the midst of a depression and try to take over the world. Now, this seems rather obvious to anyone who knows anything about genetics, but it's a useful piece of advice. But on a more serious level, this government commission examined questions like whether or not people have a sort of a right to genetic individuality and so on, whether you'd be violating that if you clone them and so on and so forth. But now you could ask, why do we care about these people, about this institution, when they don't actually have any power themselves? None of these government ethics commissions have any actual power, okay? They're simply advisory. And on the one hand, this is true. But to quote a famous political scientist, says, the definition of the alternatives is the supreme instrument of power. The definition of alternatives is the supreme instrument of power. I'll call this like agenda setting power. This reminds me of this in the university. I used to be a department administrator. And we have these lead administrators who show up at your desk and say, you have a choice between A and B, so decide. So in theory, I have the power because I'm deciding between A and B. The real power was the person who got to decide A and B are going to be on the desk. Public bioethics works the same way. They're going to bring all these alternatives, but certain things do not show up on the table at all. Okay, so this is actual sort of true power, not in the direct legal sense, but sort of a form of cultural power. So if you care about these bioethical issues, you should care about public bioethics. The institution of public bioethical debate gives advice on these bioethical matters, and that advice does have consequence for what policy is actually enacted on these issues. But whose ethics? Taking the Government Bioethics Commission as an exemplar here, whose ethics should be represented in such a group? America is famously pluralistic, with a wide range of religious and ethical positions on many issues. So I'll explain this more in my history in a few minutes, but the original impetus was that public bioethical debate would use the commonly shared values of American society. And this is a noble impulse. If you're going to have an institution with ethical agenda-setting power like this, you cannot have it represent just one group in American society. It's often said by historians that of the public sphere in America that before the 1950s, the only religious group that was really representative was mainline Protestantism that sort of controlled the show. From the 50s forward, it became a bit more diverse. My point is, this institution is broken. The type of ethical debate that it allows is not representative of the nation. So to continue my TV news metaphor, it has become MSNBC while claiming to be staffed by neutral Walter Cronkite's of CBS News. There's even a dissenting faction that looks like Fox News. Or more precisely, my argument is that bioethics has always been MSNBC while pretending to be CBS. That it's not perceived as representing the values of all Americans means it cannot fulfill the role of offering advice to our elected officials. So if you're checking back in with me, here's where I am. So let me tell you why I'm going to tell you the history of public bioethical debate. It's basically to inform our understanding of the present, to understand why I would make the recommendations that I do. We can learn from history why certain things were done. I want to talk about how it came to be that public bioethics tried to represent the nation's values, how it came to not represent the nation's values, how it came to be that public bioethics is polarized between liberals and conservatives, and the social forces that influence its practices over time, which suggests what the current system might be realistically replaced with. So, for our purposes, I mean, if we want to talk about medical ethics, obviously we can go back, Hippocratic Oath, et cetera, et cetera. But for our purposes, modern public bioethical debate begins in the 1960s. The explosion after World War II of scientific research had resulted in all these new abilities, with scientists now questioning the effects, as well as contemplating research that had previously been incomprehensible. To take an example that seems obvious to us now, this is the era of questioning, could we actually transplant someone's organs from someone else? This is innovative stuff. So during the 1960s, Al Johnson was a bioethicist at the time. He called this the decade of conferences, where scientists had many meetings to discuss the ethics of genetic engineering, population control, mind control, organ transplantation, and much more. I consider these conversations to be the emergence of this public bioethical debate. Now, during these earliest of years, scientists kept the conversation limited to scientists. They had control over the terms of the debate. The values of the public were not really considered to be part of the conversation. Moreover, many of the elite scientists were not just trying to understand the implications of their own work, but were trying to take over other debates in society, most notably a debate that had long been controlled by theologians. These scientists thought that scientists should take over discussions of what the meanings and ethics for society should be. So, for example, C.H. Waddington and Peter Medawar would imply with other biologists that the direction of evolution, both biological and cultural, should be the scientific foundation upon which to reestablish our system of ethics and to rest our most cherished hopes. Who needs religion anymore, they thought, when the meaning of life is obviously explained through evolution? This is a group of people who believe that Darwin essentially had delegitimated all religious thought. Another example comes from Robert Edwards, the first scientist to engage in vitro fertilization, who was also part of this sort of expansionist project from scientists at the time, who complained that many non-scientists see a more limited role for science, almost a fact-gathering exercise providing neither values, morals, nor standards. My answer is that moral laws must be based upon what man knows about himself, and that this knowledge inevitably comes from science. Given science is the only legitimate way of knowing anything, he concludes by agreeing with biologist Julian Huxley that today the God hypothesis has ceased to be scientifically tenable, has lost its explanatory value, and is becoming an intellectual burden to our thought. So this was provoking at the time. Theologians saw the scientists as trying to take over tasks controlled by the theological profession. For example, Methodist theologian Paul Ramsey, who was quite a polemicist actually, wrote that he was not only opposed to some of the technologies of the time, was actually opposed to what he called the surrogate theology of the cult of messianic positivism led by the scientists. At a 1965 conference, he said the scientists have a worldview of faith, no less a program for the reconstruction of mankind. These expressions rather exactly describe a religious cult, if there ever was one, a cult of men gods, however otherwise humble. These are not the findings or projections of an exact science as such, but a religious view of where and how ultimate human significance is to be found. Ramsey says, scientists are trying to create essentially a substitute religion. Theologians should defend themselves from the scientists moving on to their turfs. So, by the mid-60s, you have a discussion that was on a deeper level about a competition between theology and science, but on a surface level about whether we as a society should engage in mind control, genetic engineering, abortion, to take some of the issues of the day. But, for my point about democracy, it at least established the idea that non-scientists should have an influence on what happens with these issues, and at the time, it would have made sense that theologians would be representative of the public's views, at least on issues like these. In very few years, the public bioethics debate changes. Ramsey and the other theologians originally were using theological language, but found that it doesn't work. According to Al Johnson, who was a Catholic priest during this early involvement in the debates, he said early religious bioethicists dispensed with their outward religious appearance in order to make themselves welcome and comprehensible to the secular world. What resulted was theologians no longer using theological language, but instead trying to argue about values, principles, goals, or ends that we as a society should pursue. What was the purpose of medicine in the first place, they want to ask? What is the goal in genetically engineering somebody? They wanted to debate things like the purpose of science, what was a human, and so on. These are sort of thick or deep questions that were ultimately about people's values. It was this freewheeling debate that asked all these deep questions and represented a wide range of values found in the US. So this is one way to have a debate that represents American values. Have these theologians and others from a broad background talk about values at stake in technologies like organ transplantation. And I do think it was more representative than an era when doctors would sort of keep this discussion and decisions to themselves. But this is a very imperfect way of representing the public's values. What happens next is that the theologians and others become victims of their own success. Along with a growing group of other professionals, like philosophers and lawyers, they convince enough people that they should be worried about this, that Congress starts to be worried about this, with hearings and such from 1968 and forward. Then Senator Walter Mondale cited the emerging issue of genetic engineering and heart transplantation as urgent new developments. As he said at the time, quote, "Recent medical advances raise grave and fundamental ethical and legal questions for our society. Who shall live and who shall die? How long shall life be preserved and how should it be altered? Who will make the decisions? How shall society be prepared?" During this time, we also have revelations about the Tuskegee experiment conducted by the US government, where poor black men were left with untreated syphilis despite treatment being available in order to study the progression of the disease. The revelation of the Tuskegee experiment and revelation of similar experimental programs on orphans, prisoners, and others make the ethics of human experimentation take center stage. So, Congress sets up the first Government Bioethics Advisory Board. Essentially creating an institution that can advise policymakers about these sorts of issues. It's called, and this is quite a mouthful, the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Human experimentation is the first bioethical issue where the people in public bioethical debate would have a direct and formal advisory role to public officials. This is 1974. So how do you have the public's views input into something like this? So far, so good in terms of my ideal. The original method, which remains in force today, was to make sure that the people on the commission are diverse. And this is not easy. You can imagine one way to do this would be to have every state legislature nominate one person, and then 12 could be randomly selected from 50. So people from Texas would be, conservative, people from Massachusetts would be liberal, and you might result in some sort of fairly diverse views that way. But that's not how these things work. The commission and all subsequent commissions for the past 40 years have decided that one way to ensure diversity is that there would be a mix of men and women, racial diversity when possible, but mostly they focus on making sure commissioners are not just scientists, but also philosophers, sociologists, and others. I should say this does not result in value diversity. So one of the other things I do is I study public opinion. And if you do a public opinion study of any bioethical issue, you will find that professional status does nothing to predict someone's opinion on any of these sorts of things. Gender does essentially nothing to predict someone's opinion on any of these sorts of issues. There's only two variables that matter: education level and religion, okay? And you can imagine how many people without PhDs are on these commissions. Well, there's some MDs, okay, some lawyers, but you can count on one hand the number of people who only, quote unquote, have bachelor's degrees on these commissions over the past 40 years, even though only a third of people in the United States have such a degree. So there is no diversity there. And then religiously, people are either unidentifiable or from liberal religious traditions. So on the first commission, one of the theologians was from the United Church of Christ, and the other was a Jesuit in the midst of quitting the church because he thought Vatican II did not go far enough in liberalizing the church. So there's no diversity that really matters in the end on these sorts of issues. But actually, I mentioned this more as an aside for how we should think about the future, because I don't think that's the actual biggest problem here. Let me continue my story. At about this time, we see emergence of a new idea, the theologians, it could be argued, were not really representing the values of the public, but only their faction of the public. Even when they're translating their theological language into secular language, it's not clear how they could ever be seen as representing the public's values. So a new profession emerges with a new idea. Not theologians, not scientists, not lawyers, but something new, a bioethicist. So to get my terminology straight, there's a separate profession called bioethicist that participates in bioethics debates, okay? And a bioethicist is distinct from these other professions. The one thing that makes them distinct is that they are explicitly not using their own values in any discussion. They claim to be using someone else's values. So in a hospital, they're not going to tell you what to do or what your values should be. They are going to help you clarify your own values. In the public sphere, this profession comes to be the one to say, we are going to clarify Americans' values, not ours, Americans. Whereas people in the theological tradition are more easily seen as essentially representing their own values or the values of their own particular group. In public bioethical debate about what policy should be about something like cloning, a bioethicist will say their values are those of the general public that claim to be neutral. So how can you do this? Well, the profession came to promote something called common morality. The first task of the new commission was to determine the common morality to use when conducting experiments on humans. And these are called principles. So far, so good. I've already identified myself as someone who believes in democracy in these sort of ethical perspectives. So this sounds great. What is the public's common morality or principles about human experimentation? If I was giving this lecture in 1974, I'd be very happy. I want to say that if there's anyone in this room who's intimately familiar with the exact historical moment, this is where I'm glossing over some details for ease of presentation. I'm glossing over how 3 principles became 4, so if anyone's really intimately familiar with that debate, forgive me. But to generalize, the commission was soon be seen to have endorsed 4 principles that are representative of public morality: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, which means, roughly speaking, autonomy means making your own decisions about yourself, beneficence means doing good, non-maleficence means avoiding harm, and justice means treating people equally or fairly. How was it determined that this was the common morality of the American public? This was, I think, the first of 2 key mistakes that would ultimately lead to the current dysfunctional situation in public bioethics. I don't fault the people involved because hindsight is 2020. There are 2 mechanisms they use to identify everyone's morality in this room. First, reflection by the commissioners and employees of the commission about historical events and what they say about American principles. Second, once these have been proposed, a consensus among these diverse commissioners meant that they must have identified something that's truly universally held by Americans. This critical meeting where they decided this happened on Al Johnson's roof deck in San Francisco in 1974. The key mistake is I don't think that a room full of people, essentially all of whom have Ph.D. degrees, who are either not obviously religious or all religious liberals, can accurately decide what the public's values are through reflecting on what they know about U.S. history. Regardless, the report of this group is accepted by the government and became a part of federal regulations having to do with experimentation on humans. They are the federal regulations to this day. So, we are at this point in our history here where I explain how public bioethical debate came to be dominated by this profession with this particular method of representing the public's values through articulating the common morality. So it's important to know why this works because it'll teach us some lessons about where to go from here. Imagine if a study was published that showed that a chiropractor could adjust your back and solve every mental and emotional problem that anyone ever has, okay? It would immediately drive 2 professions out of business. Okay? Psychology, psychiatry would be gone. Okay? Professions engage in this competition between each other. And bioethics was incredibly successful with this new idea that we, this new profession, aren't representing our own values, we're representing someone else's values. The obvious losers in this situation was theology, which still exists in these debates, but gets essentially shunted a bit to the side into its own debate. Principlism comes to be the way to make ethical arguments in these debates. How does this happen? Well, there are other things that this new profession was doing at the time, and principlism was perfect for these tasks. The most obvious one was to administer the institutional review boards that were asked to evaluate human research across the United States. Every university, including this one, has one of these boards that decides whether a research project on human subjects should go forward. Very quickly, the government mandated that the principlist system be used to represent the public's ethics, and this continues to this day. Needless to say, if you can get the government to endorse your profession's way of doing things, that's the most ironclad way of making sure your profession is going to succeed. So if I were to go and operate on someone in this room, I would be thrown in jail. That's a powerful profession, medicine. Soon this principlist system takes over ethical decision-making in medical care. Historian David Rothman writes, "The new rules for the laboratory," by which he means this principlist system, "permeated the examining room, circumscribing the discretionary authority of the individual physicians." So why was it successful for public bioethics? The earlier debate had included secular-sounding theologians who arguably represented the public's values in a loose way. People were bringing up all sorts of values in these debates, and nothing was really off the table. However, it came to be thought that a better way of representing the public's values was to claim that you're using these universally held public values to make decisions. Why did that work? This will help us think about the future. Remember, the primary audience of this are these government officials. And imagine you're an unelected administrator at the National Institutes of Health, and you need to have an ethical policy group on human genetic engineering. Would you rather listen to a group where the ethics was some sort of negotiation between idiosyncratic views of people in the room, or an ethics that's portrayed as a reflection of the consensual values of all Americans? The safer bet is the latter, because you're not picking, as this unelected government official, what values you want to emphasize. You're simply mechanically implementing the will of the American people. So who's going to complain about an unelected official at the NIH or something mechanically following the principles that are held by all Americans? Principlism also spreads because it's a lot more simple, and this is important, a lot more simple than other forms of ethical argumentation. There are a limited number of principles to consider, and you just have to make sure you're maximizing them. So if this is, I know I'm in a university right now, and so saying something like this is simple is usually an insult. Your argument is really simple. Okay, that's an insult. However, this is not academia I'm talking about. This is where real people have to make actual decisions, okay? And simplification is a virtue. This is a good thing because you cannot expect every person who's involved with an ethical decision in a government agency to first go get a Ph.D. in philosophy. The third reason is transparency. With a lot of these earlier ethical arguments from the 1960s, such as the debate the theologians were involved with, you can read the entire thing and not be entirely sure what values they're talking about. You're not sure if the public's views are being represented, whereas this is much more transparent. You're considering principles 1, 2, and 3. So I'm seemingly nearing the end here. But problems with this system are apparent. And what are the problems with principlism from this democratic perspective? The key problem is that I don't believe that the 4 principles I mentioned are representative of the public's ethics. And as I already mentioned, the first reason was that they were identified in this very ad hoc manner through reflection, sort of armchair reflection on American history, by a very unusual group, unrepresented group of people. However, I could be convinced that these four principles are fairly close to what the public would think about for the problem they originally identified, which was human experimentation. I can be convinced that people don't want to be experimented upon without their permission. They would rather have it do good instead of harm. I could be easily convinced of this. We don't actually know, but I could be convinced. But the problem is that very soon after it was determined that these were the public's values for human experimentation, it was decided that these were the public's values for all issues in public bioethical debate. In Al Johnson's word, principlism, quote, grew from the principles underlying the conduct of research into the basic principles of bioethics. Therefore, these are the ethical values that you would have to be maximizing when you're discussing whether to clone people, engage in human enhancement, decide who should get a kidney, and anything else. And I don't believe that the public would think that maximizing reproductive autonomy is the most important value when it comes to something like cloning. One indicator of the non-representativeness of principles is that they cannot be used to say no to anything that a legitimate scientist wants to do. So let's take human cloning. If you do a public opinion on this, 94% of people are opposed to cloning or something like this. So how would you analyze cloning using principlism? Well, maximizing autonomy means that if there's someone who wants to clone themselves, that's their autonomous choice, so that would be okay. Now, we'll use beneficence and non-maleficence. Well, assuming that whomever wants to do this is going to claim that it's some benefit to themselves, you can't use that principle to say no to cloning. But you could say, well, non-maleficence kicks in, it's not safe. Okay? Well, what if cloning was determined to be safe? Okay? Indeed, if you look at the Clinton-era Bioethics Commission and how they discussed this issue, they came to the conclusion that there should be a temporary moratorium on human cloning because it's not safe. As Dan Callahan pointed out at the time, that means that if it was demonstrated to be safe, implicitly it would be fine. Callahan thought there were other principles that should be debated besides safety. The other problem is that certain government officials have lost faith in the entire enterprise. Principlism, according to its primary theorists, is based on common morality. It's supposed to be the CBS News, the neutral common ground of American culture. The conservatives begin to decide that public bioethical concerns are actually MSNBC, masquerading as CBS. This threatens the very idea of public bioethical debate that represents all the citizens' values, and thus the institution of public bioethical debate is threatened. So an example of this, consider the exchange between an advocate of establishing a bioethics commission to decide about ethics of embryo research and Republican Representative Dennis Hastert. Hastert says, so actually we have a board of people who are quote-unquote experts, and they're actually making moral decisions from a wide spectrum. Even at this table, we have quite a divergent view of what's right and wrong. But somebody in the place of the legislature would be making these decisions on whether this in vitro fertilization for the purpose of experimentation should take place or should not take place. So Hastert clearly does not accept that the Bioethics Commission's recommendations were going to be neutral. And I do think this is actually from where I'm standing right now, which is Bob Dornan, close by. 1992, writes this letter. Instead of receiving advice from the NIH's Bioethics Commission called the Human Embryo Research Panel, he had advice for it. He wrote, given the new realities of Congress, let it be known that we plan to use every legislative means available to prevent federal funds from being spent on grotesque research of this nature. I hope you will keep this in mind as you consider the recommendations of the Human Embryo Research Panel. Dornan had said what the ethical policy was going to be, and if the Bioethics Commission comes to a different conclusion, it was going to be ignored. The fact that conservatives were not going to listen to bioethicists suggests that the ethical positions that are derived from purportedly universal values are not universal. The crisis in bioethical debate becomes evident with the George Bush administration. He appoints a federal bioethics commission, much more conservative than its predecessor, that explicitly rejects principlism. There are now two camps of bioethicists, both of whom call themselves bioethicists, the liberals and the conservatives. Articles start appearing with quotes like, "Bioethics seems destined for a short lifespan." Another scholar goes so far as to say, "Does bioethics exist?" The reason for the question is that as bioethics has acquired academic standing, institutional authority, and public visibility, just what constitutes bioethics is increasingly murky. There's a pervasive fear, since there are now two camps of bioethicists, no bioethicist was going to be listened to at all. Dan Callahan, arguably the founder of modern bioethics, wrote at the time, "People are going to conclude that we are all frauds." It is my position that the cause of this legitimate crisis was public bioethics is that its system of representing all of the public's values is faulty. I think that my friends in the liberal bioethics establishment have decided to ignore this problem and not think about it. Their explanation for the decline of public bioethics being seen as neutral is that conservatives showed up as if they weren't part of the United States. The liberal bioethics explanations of the crisis start with the conservative bioethicists who became more visible in the Bush administration. In the view of the liberal bioethicists, the newcomers did not accept what Jonathan Moreno calls the great bioethics compromise, that technology is largely good and should be encouraged with some guidance. Similarly, Alta Charo writes, "There's a cultural divide in bioethics between those who celebrate the transformative power of science and those who fear it." Another explanation is the lack of civility between the liberal and conservative factions. Note in the following quote, the reiteration that public bioethics is a neutral ethical debate that represents the values of all Americans. For example, Kaplan writes that the level of emotion characteristic of many current debates may simply disqualify bioethics and bioethicists from their historic and hard-earned role as independent voices of reason, as well as trustworthy sources of objective analysis in America, still deeply divided among religious, cultural, class, ethnic, and racial lines. Similarly, my friend John Moreno says, bioethics grew partly because it promised to provide a space for morally neutral, apolitical discourse. For many reasons, including the charged environment created by a deeply divided policy, the event of the President's Council of Bioethics, which is the Bush administration, had occasioned a shock to the field's academic civility and a consequent threat to the great bioethics compromise. The crisis, in this view, is caused by two sides that cannot reach agreement, not allowing bioethics to speak with its authoritative voice. So, I think that what's happened since the Bush era is that conservatives are back to being ignored. Liberal bioethics is just proceeding like it did for decades. But I still think the liberals should be better off if they tried to change bioethical debate. Now, at this point, people are thinking to themselves, why bother? We could have a couple different solutions here. Bioethics could remain in two camps. There could be the liberal ones and the conservative ones. And whenever a Democrat is elected president, they would come to power, and Republican, the other ones could come to power. Okay? This would be an acknowledgement of our hopelessly polarized times. And I am, I guess, learned over the years that I'm sort of an old school liberal in a sort of political sense, where I think we should resist that impulse to not talk to each other. Now, this would result in decisions being made, but it violates the original vision of bioethics as representing the views of all the citizens. It also contributes to balkanization. So, another course we could say is that we could hope that the conservatives go away and you return to an era of 30 years ago where it was more convincing that a National Bioethics Commission from whatever president somehow represented the nation. It was a lot easier before 1979 when evangelical Protestants were not particularly involved in the public sphere, and it wasn't really in your face. After 1979, the value diversity in the public sphere becomes a little more obvious. I think that the conservatives are now in shadow institutions, and they will be back. Conservatives can hope the liberals go away, and that's not happening either. Moreover, I think that a liberal should want the conservative values to be represented in public debates, because otherwise it's not democratic, and the same should go for the conservatives. Reflecting on my van ride at the Hastings Center many years ago, I still believe that you learn something from talking to people you disagree with. So what do we do? Well, how can you make it legitimate in the eyes of all policymakers that this is representing the values of all Americans? I actually think we need to fiddle with principlism to make it more democratic. Now, if this is a room full of everyone with studying ethics, this would result in just a scream of outrage. I've just described the thinnest, most simplistic form of ethics. Everyone says, this is this not serious way of addressing ethical problems. But I think the history of bioethics has shown us that socially, if you're going to create a social institution, you are left with something like this. I agree that principlism should not be used in academic debate or in discussions about what people should do as groups of citizens. However, when it comes to ethical policy, I think it's the best we can do. To paraphrase Winston Churchill's comments about democracy, principlism is the worst method of determining an ethical stance, except for all the others that have been tried. Having a government commission maximize the ethical principles of the public has a number of virtues. It's simple enough that the public, who have all other concerns and day jobs, will be able to understand it. This is critical for democracy. If people can see their own public values represented in an ethical decision, it would have more legitimacy. So, how can principlism be modified to make it more convincing? If it can be made more convincing, it'll be much more difficult for people just to say it's all bunk. Step one, reject the idea that principles or values apply to all issues. This makes the values held by the public to be more specific for each issue. So while I could be convinced that the current principles of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice represent the values that all Americans would want to consider with human experimentation, I don't think they represent the values that Americans would want to be considered with human cloning or anything else. You would have principles A, B, and C for one, A, C, and G for another, A, B, D, and H for another. Again, this increased specificity means that the public is more likely to recognize its values in this morality. Step two is to find a more convincing way to identify commonly held values. It's striking that despite the claim that the current version of principles are universally held, no one has actually asked the public what their principles are. The way the public's values were determined was by a bunch of people in the room, all who had PhDs, reflecting on past disputes. I think the public and elected officials are never going to accept that this is the way to determine the values of the public. So I suggest empirically deriving the principles of society on an issue through social science. And now I think the terminologies, I make a shout out, I see some PhDs in sociology in the room. This is the Sociology Full Employment Act of 2014. In actuality, this wouldn't require that much extra effort. I will not go into great detail about how this happens, but suffice it to say this is standard operating procedure for social science. I did a study a few years ago that would be described as creating 4 principles that religiously oriented Americans would want to hold for reproductive genetic technologies. You can do the exact same thing for the general public. Now, this method is not perfect. It requires interpretation. The researchers themselves would be prone to bias. Who would make this decision? And it would all be very messy. And some issues you would have 4 values, 5 values, et cetera, et cetera. However, I would still submit to you that this would be a more accurate way than having a bunch of people in the room sort of reflect on what they think American culture thinks. This is not holding a public opinion poll and asking for a conclusion, like what do you want to do about human cloning? Another one of my critics called this technocracy, my proposal to be technocracy light. I'm still holding out a position for essentially academic authority and decision making here, but it's using different raw material. It's using the American values as raw material and then filling in a lot of details with ethical expertise, and I do believe there is such a thing. What would these professional bioethicists do with my system? They would still do what they do now in the system, which is weigh and balance the principles of others, but they would be more accurate depictions of what the values of the public actually are. So let's use cloning as an example. Let's say one of my colleagues, and who knows if they're doing this, is actually figured out how to clone someone. A bioethics profession would commission a study of the public to see what values are important in a decision like this. Beneficence? I think that would probably make the list if you did a study of the public. Autonomy? I think so too. But so would something called something like not being in total control of nature. And so would another one that would be called something like not treating humans like objects. How would a bioethics commission make a recommendation based upon these values? And I don't know, but it would be a more accurate depiction of what the public's values input to an ethical recommendation would be. I fully expect, I should add, that some ethical issues will not be able to have recommendations at all because they reflect the hopelessly polarized values of American society. For example, I think that anything having to do with an embryo is unlikely to be the subject of bioethical contribution, and that's unfortunate, but it's actually accurate, and I think it's actually better to have the truly polarized nature of American society reflected that way instead of an artificial consensus generated through the use of principlism. So I'm behind. So let's talk about the primary objection here, which is that I'm ignoring truth. Ethics involves truth, not just weighing opinions. So in response, I would say that I would also call for vigorous ethical conversation about truth, with everyone having opinions about cloning or whatever else utterly independent of what the majority of the public thinks, outside of this process of public bioethical debate. I think that those who believe the most important value in debate about cloning is the sanctity of human life should convince people of the truth of that. Other people should try to convince people that the most important value in the debate about cloning is reproductive autonomy of women. People have to advocate for truth in the public sphere because they cannot give up on believing that things are true. However, the reality is, in a pluralistic country, my truth probably is not your truth. We have to figure out how to live in the same place. We have to compromise our truth all the time to live together. And I'll just use my examples that my ethical values have never been represented in US military policy, but I still live here. Number two, some would say this is relativist because I let the values of the public be determinative, even if those values are wrong. I have two responses, which is, first, it's hard to imagine who in a liberal democracy has the authority to label a value of the general public as wrong. And secondly, if my proposal is relative, then so is democracy, because that is driven by the values of the people, some of which are wrong. If, as pointed out by Michael Walzer many years ago, philosophers cannot be in a position to determine what the values of the public should be, because that would result in technocracy. So, to conclude and to summarize, we face lots of new issues every day. I talk to these science guys on my campus, and you wouldn't believe the things that they are cooking up, every single one of which has implications that we as a collective need to decide what to do. Maybe we'll let everyone make their own autonomous choice. Great, but that's a choice in and of itself, that that's going to be our orientation. Our elected officials are not prepared to think through all the ethical ins and outs of these issues, understandably so. Public bioethical debate helpfully describes various ethical considerations and helps make ethical recommendations. It helpfully clarifies things for policymakers, and it needs to exist. But it's not healthy right now because it's not seen as actually representing the public of the US. So I propose that this be fixed to make it more representative of the values of the people in the United States. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Evans, for that great presentation. Responding to Professor Evans' presentation this evening is Professor Roberto Dell'Oro. Dr. Dell'Oro is the director of the Bioethics Institute and a professor in the Department of Theological Studies here at LMU. He studied philosophy and theology in Milan, Munich, and the Gregorian University in Rome, where in 1992 he earned a doctorate in theology. He was a visiting scholar in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, and until 2003, a research scholar at the Center for Clinical Bioethics at Georgetown. Dr. Dell'Oro has lectured widely in the US, Europe, and Latin America. In addition to 2 book translations from German, he is the author and co-author of 3 books: Health and Human Flourishing, Religion, Moral Anthropology, and Medicine, Moral Experience and the Person, Dietrich von Hildebrand's Phenomenological ethics, and the history of bioethics, history of bioethics, international perspectives. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dilk.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you, Elizabeth, for your kind introduction and for running the show tonight. Thank you, Professor Evans, for a stimulating and I would say provocative presentation. For a while now, Professor Evans has distinguished himself in his scholarship as a kind of challenger of the bioethical establishment, a sort of enfant terrible of bioethics. In his critique of the history and practice of bioethics, he is careful to avoid the pitfall of skeptical resignation. I've learned a lot from his work, which offers important suggestions and constructive criticism, and for sure his lecture tonight goes in this direction as well. So in my response, which will be brief, I intend to focus on the central theme of Professor Evans' lecture, namely the relation of bioethics to public discourse. I guess my scope is broader than his, for in my remarks I go beyond the limits of so-called regulatory bioethics, that is, the dimension of bioethical discourse most proximate, if not parasitical, to the concerns of public policy and law. The legitimacy of such a dimension will not be questioned, for I take bioethics to be plurivocal in nature, offering the space for a symphony of perspectives that include, though are not reduced to, the regulatory dimension. So one of the central goals of Professor Evans' presentation is to unmask the presumption of public bioethicists to speak for the American people. The critique goes not only to the issue of inclusivity, though he complains that the liberal perspective has de facto taken control of public bioethics, but also, and perhaps especially, to the relative thinness of the ethical framework that drives public discussion. I concur on this with Professor Evans. Unlike him, however, I do not think the philosophical problems of the ethical framework that serves our public debate can be solved only by an empirical recourse to the resources of social science. Without disputing the obvious importance of the latter's contribution, I submit that because of its object, the form of mindfulness bioethics desperately needs today is a kind of passion for the ultimate questions, rather than a political preoccupation with the construction of moral consensus. Secondly, I submit that part of the public mission of bioethics is precisely to contribute to the intellectual formation of the citizens in the polis, so that they can reach the competence necessary to make informed decisions, rather than delegate such responsibility to experts who presume to speak vicariously for them. The essential contribution of bioethics is thus to broaden, rather than narrow, the horizons of the questions being asked in the public realm, beyond the constraints imposed by an artificial neutral framework. Certain arguments never make it to the public space because the latter has bracketed the meaningfulness of the questions for which these arguments are supposed to obtain in the first place. Such a sanitized version of bioethics no longer dwells on the conflicts of interpretation and meaning, but speaks the analytic language of principles, rules, specification and balancing, etc. The concerns of bioethics seem to have become almost exclusively pragmatic, functional to the articulation of public policy on a variety of issues. As a result, premises of a deeper philosophical nature, unquestionably central to any ethical reflection, tend to be pushed to the side, bioethics has almost turned into a kind of philosophy light, in which the presumed versatility of a cluster of ethical principles to make sense for all bioethical questions has become inversely proportionate to its ability to salvage the specific complexity of each of those issues, and more importantly, to uncover the recessive premises at work in the way such issues are being addressed. Consider the case recently publicized in the news, to which I think John appealed before, concerning the FDA discussion for approval of an in vitro fertilization technique, which in an attempt to prevent certain illnesses like muscular dystrophy and respiratory problems, uses DNA from 3 people. Most commentators, especially scientists and doctors, and not just on CBS or MSNBC, pretty much on every channel, welcome the advent of yet another technological fix to a congenital predisposition with an attitude of unquestionable awe. On the other hand, the more critically minded are willing to grant that some moral problems for this 3-parent baby solution, as it has been called, do exist after all. Doubts about safety are raised, together with the fear of unforeseen eugenic slippery slopes. Strangely passed over in silence, though, remains the most obvious question: whose child will this baby be? Of course, experts are quick to rebut this preoccupation as scientifically naive, if not totally unfounded. They reassure the concerned public that because the female donor of healthy mitochondrial DNA to the defective biological mother provides in the end a very negligible genetic contribution, she cannot be described appropriately as a parent. However, when considered from another angle, namely that of the personal identity of a child thus produced, the question, whose child will this baby be, comes to the fore as actually very serious. This is so because personal identity is now imperiled by what I would call an ambiguity of belonging, in which the embodied matrix of traceable biological deaths represents for the child in question more an opportunity for doubt than a condition for self-identification. The lack of evidence about one's distinct genetic lineage turns the trust in the source that gives to be, under normal circumstances, the syngamy of 2 genomes, into puzzlement about one's own origin and identity. The ethical judgment on this technology is not the issue tonight. Suffice it to say that its complexity, as for the judgment on all the other artificial reproductive technologies, stems from the fact that it involves much more than a balancing of ethical principles like autonomy versus beneficence. It involves a more robust discussion about the premises that drive these technologies in the first place, such as the meaning of embodiment and the embodied self, the nature of parenthood, the goals of medicine in reshaping the nature of procreation, etc. So I guess the issue is deeper than just an empirical reconstruction of people's voices on the issues of bioethics, and I don't want to trivialize your point here. As for most of those issues, the average citizen does not know what to think. Moreover, the public brand as normative rather than purely descriptive concept cannot be identified simply with the opinions of the majority. Even the supporters of a 4-principle approach would grant that the common morality cannot be reduced and should not be confused with customary morality. To quote from the well-known text of Tom Beechamp and James Childress, a kind of Bible of bioethics, the general norms in the common morality, I quote, provides a basis for evaluating and criticizing customary morality viewpoints that are in some respect deficient, end quote. The problem, however, is that though defined by the aspirations to become an ideal community of discourse, the public run, as Jürgen Habermas has emphasized, remains historically determined, subject to mechanisms of reduction and alienation. We do not need to go too far to realize that in a situation where technology and the market forces have so great a role in molding and transforming our visions of what is good for human beings, even reasons and arguments can become merely technical, reflecting strategies for the achievement of goals whose value is measured by an instrumental rather than a specifically moral criteria. So I believe that when understood as essentially defined by a critique of the recessive premises of any given issue, the contribution of bioethics to the public brand will look more like a thorn in the flesh of public moral convictions than an appeasing blessing on the latest developments of science and technology. A bioethics that takes seriously its public responsibility in this way will stand somewhat in between, neither the valet of reaction nor the obsequious servant of what was referenced in the lecture as the great bioethics compromise. That is, the uncritical belief that technology is largely good and should be encouraged to thrive on the sole premises of safety and fairness in the distribution of its potential benefits. Such bioethics would be disappointingly inadequate to any public expectation for critical inquiry. A bioethics dressed in elegant ethical theories, perhaps, but nonetheless a cheap sophistry that leaves us still unwise, our deepest questions unanswered. Thank you.
Dr. Evans, would you like to respond to Dr. Delaro's comments before opening up the conversation?
I'll be brief. Just to add a complexity, sort of to add to the point about essentially how this is essentially an incredibly thin form of ethics. It doesn't answer the sort of deeper questions. So in the broader book that this is based, and I should add that for every one I sell, 90 cents goes to my daughter's college education fund. So buy early and buy often. You know, academics make so much money off their books. Their broader conception is actually, Roberto and I are a bit in disagreement about this, but closer than I think it might appear, which is that I also call for, I think I called it something like a public ends commission or values commission, okay? This thing I portrayed today was essentially there's fixed values or goals or ends, and do these technologies meet them? I call for a public debate about these deeper questions parallel with this that's not about policy itself. And so I think the difference is more like not whether or not there should be these deeper questions where people don't use principlism to address. They use all of the broader discourses that they come with to have those discussions. And so I'm limiting to this thin debate to a pretty narrow part of bioethics, which is explicitly, essentially, government advice. So I do want this thicker, deeper debate where people bring their own particularistic languages from their own traditions, and it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. But it's in a different sort of space socially.
Now we'd like to open up the conversation to the wider audience. Our graduate assistant, Sue Gilmer, has a microphone that she can bring to you. I'd encourage people to introduce yourselves briefly and speak clearly into the microphone so that everyone can hear. So I'm going to give this to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Roberto, for your presentations. I think John's response was correct. You were trying to figure out this complex thing of public policy when there's so much diversity and how to manage that. Roberto brought, I think, a deeper philosophical set of questions on the issue. Two things in my mind. One is, I tell my students at the University of Southern California always, you alone must make up your mind, but you should never make it up alone. And the difficulty is that so many of them have this kind of image of autonomy which separates them from the larger community. They think independence is not really paying attention to anybody's opinion. I think maturity is knowing whose opinion to respect. So it's interdependence, not independence that we seek. That's one dimension. I'd have to sell that in the public forum, I understand it. The second thing I would mention, I really was interested, I didn't know much about it, but the history you gave of the biological, bioethical committees, that's really instructive. And I think anybody who takes enough time to look at history, say for me within the Catholic tradition, it gives you some confidence and some perspective, but there are also red flags. On the eve of the Civil War, there was not a single Catholic bishop in this United States that opposed the institution of slavery. That's rather sobering. So if you study the history and so on and so forth, but we are a nation that's so presentist, immediate. We all learned about the resignation of the Secret Service director. So we have a problem, deeper history, a question of realizing the nature of the person, the community. Those are things that I would be biased towards and would try to present and contribute to the public discussion.
Amy, I think in my first book, it's funny, I think you would say that I changed my mind between the first book and this last book. Because the first book was essentially bemoaning the thinness of bioethics, and I essentially was called a principlism basher at that point, and said that the debate should actually be about these deep questions that everyone should contribute to using their own particularistic perspective. And then, after further study, I came to the conclusion that in a complex bureaucratic state, and something has to be used in hospitals, you know, the profession needs to use this system not only in public bioethics, but in hospitals and other places. You know, 90% or more of people who make these ethical commissions in hospitals, the ethics committees, don't have degrees in ethics. They're people who have day jobs. They're actually nurses, they're doctors who do this on the side. You can't create these elaborate, you know, philosophical systems. So I sort of changed my mind, but I still want to carve out a place for, you know, ideally recreate this Hastings Center experience I had back in the day, where the people from divergent perspectives, not speaking common morality principle, but the sort of richness of their own tradition, show up, and then in some very abstract sense, 20 years later, American values have changed when some group convinces everyone else of the wisdom of their perspective.
So first of all, thank you very much. Very enjoyable. The question I want to pose is, I did not hear, honestly, the role of religious perspectives in your discussion. The theology, you know, primarily people who are professional bioethics and so forth, where is religion? So I'm going to give you an example of how, an issue that how we did in a very unique area. So there's an old age home, a lot of people, and the question is, do you have everyone do a do not resuscitate order because of over 70 years old, doing an aggressive form of CPR actually generally cause some of the bones to go into the vital organs and so forth. And so the doctors are very clear, as the scientists, you should all have no type of resuscitation. Now, what we did is we brought in to the people, scientists, doctors, and bioethicists to give their points of view. And then we had each of the people there talk to their own religious leader to get their religious perspectives. And then we said is each person there will then make their own decision, which the doctors on staff will then follow. So it was an integration of bioethicists, philosophers, and also their own religion to give them that type of basically individual autonomy, but not a group forced effort. So I like what we did there. And I wasn't hearing that type of voice here. Up at UCSB, where I'm on the commission or the committee dealing with all the stem cell research, and we approve different things, I'm the voice of religion that's on that committee. And my view there is religion, I think, gives a viewpoint as to where we want to go, what type of society we want to create. And so that voice often I don't hear with the four things you just mentioned. So I'm asking both of you, do you see a role? How would you bring that in?
Well, so the example you give of a particular situation, I would consider that to be not public bioethics. And so in that instance, the public bioethics actually has deemed meta-level policy, which is that individuals in these institutions decide by themselves and with the advice of others if they want. So absolutely, people should refer to their own religious tradition, negotiate with their own conscience, and decide. Now, and then if it's an IRB at UCSB, you're actually mandated to follow these principles. And I know that that's a very loose abstraction describing what happens, but in sort of most generalized sense. But I think you're actually, you're pointing to another issue, is where is religion when it comes to this sort of thing I'm talking about? And the answer is, which I probably will not be satisfactory, it's averaged in to this general principles that I would discern from the public. And so, the thing you got to be tolerant here, and this is, I think, where social science trains you to be tolerant of this, which is, can you imagine the degree of generalization I have to make to say that there are 4 general values that are going to be forward with something? I have to do violence to incredible detail, okay? I mean, so let's just talk, let's talk anything having to do with embryos, right? Generally in Judaism, extracorporeal embryos do not have sort of moral status in the same way. In Catholicism, the theological anthropology is specific, it means something different. In mainline Protestants, that's just the religions, right? Let alone secular perspectives. And so it's a massive generalization, but I would say on a debate not about policy, that should all be there, everyone knows specific positions. But when it comes to making this sort of policy, that I think we don't have a choice but to result in this massive generalization across. So it would be folded in, so to speak.
Yeah, can I just quickly? I guess John and I are very much in agreement on a lot of things, but there's something about the underlying notion of what public means that might be slightly different. When we talk about public bioethics, I think you are referring more what I would call regulatory bioethics. That is the kind of bioethics that is immediately concerned with the creation of public policy.
Yes.
When I talk about public bioethics, on the other hand, I'm thinking about the public realm. Yeah. Now the question here is, there's something very important about the articulation of common morality, specifically in the United States, obviously without trivializing the meaning of common morality as what everybody thinks, because the notion of common morality has a very normative character in itself. So common morality expresses the commitment to fundamental moral values or moral principles that have the, if you want, the claim of being universal to a certain extent, trans-historic. Let's leave aside the deep philosophical questions or whether one can ever come up with those principles, and more importantly, whether anybody can come up with those principles independently of the historical process that actually generates them. But the real question is that to have something like a framework of common morality forces each religious tradition not simply to remain in its own territory and to speak to its own adepts, but rather to formulate a public argument. And I think that is the challenge of public bioethics in this, if you want, thicker sense. That is more complex, right? I believe that the particular mission of bioethics is to instruct the public realm about those very perspectives. But to do so, religious perspectives have to become able to speak the public language. Now, every religion has to figure that out on its own, obviously. But it seems to me that to throw away the baby with the dirty water is very problematic, right? In other words, I believe that if there is one interesting aspect about bioethics as a field, it is the fact that it forces religious traditions to speak a public language. That doesn't mean to neutralize their own premises, but in fact it means to instruct the public about moral insights and values that perhaps would remain recessive and in fact unknown were they not be articulated in public. And I think that makes bioethics interesting to me, philosophically, but in fact also theologically. Right? So the tendency of religious traditions is to sublate the entire common ground under its own premises. That's impossible in a democratic society. So the challenge that religion has to accept is to become able to articulate a public argument. What exactly is the form of that argument? That's very complex, but that's the challenge.
So if there's any undergrads in the room, the assignment for tomorrow is to figure out how it is that I'm about to say, I agree with him. And I'm actually willing to reformulate what I'm calling regulatory ethics, that's fine. And I agree that essentially my ideal is the public sphere in a more broad sense, that this university would have two people up here who totally disagree about cloning and whatever else and speak in their own particularistic languages, yet I agree the challenge for religions in the modern world is to come up with a way to make yourself understandable in public. If you just use your own theological language, no one's going to understand anything what you're talking about, right? And those of you from the Christian tradition, just think about the gospel writers. Each one of them had a particular audience in mind, and they talked differently depending on the audience. So this is what religions do. Okay, so I agree that's one of the great challenges, and I would ask that people have public debates about all these issues using the thickest, most deeply meaningful debates they can possibly have, and come to some sort of understanding. But then when it comes to let's call it regulatory ethics, that's when my system kicks in.
Yeah, I agree.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hopefully I can formulate this well after those two excellent responses to the last question. So I was originally going to ask this question in terms of scientific literacy of the people who would be engaging in this sort of debate, but after the last response I could expand that to include religious literacy. So unless these groups are going to be composed of just slightly larger groups of experts that would still exclude public opinion writ large, I see sort of two challenges, not necessarily problems for this. One is the appalling lack of scientific literacy with respect to the average American participant in this dialogue. But the second one that just comes out of the conversation we just had here is, for a lot of people, a appalling lack of familiarity with their own religious traditions. So substantial majority of American Christians think the phrase "God helps those who help themselves" can be found in the Bible, which for those of us who read the Bible seems shocking, right? But that would affect the values that you express as a Christian. And so I just wonder what you have to say about this issue of what sort of people are up for the kind of dialogue that it sounds great here, but in terms of scientific literacy and then literacy about their own values. Thank you.
Thank you. So, in my view of how you would find the values of the public, part of the reality of America is scientific ignorance and ignorance of your own religion, but they're the voters and they're the ones who live here, and so that has to, unfortunately, be the way it works, right? That's one of the reasons why I'm engaged in technocracy light, which is that I suspect that most people think, yeah, if you clone Hitler, he's going to get a little mustache, and try to take over the world, not realizing the science of that, right? So that's where I would leave the sort of role for experts. I do think you can get people's values out of interviewing them even if they claim to be, yeah, I'm evangelical, goes to church every Sunday, but I can't name the Gospels, right? Which is, yeah, I agree, shockingly common, okay? But that's the way it is. So then in terms of groups, but I'm sort of positing a group of these are these professional ethicists who would be taking this raw material of the public's values and combining it into some sort of ethical analysis / recommendation. What I was talking about here in the end is like people coming to this room and having a debate. Here's where, I just think the illiteracy of the public or whatever is just one of the things that needs to be solved by more public debate and, people who hopefully want to learn more about their tradition. But I guess this is one reason why, I think it's a good thing we do not live in a direct democracy. And I'm a big believer in representative democracy because I don't want the public voting on every single conclusion. I want to elect our officials who generally share our values, who can work out the details. So we're stuck with the system we have. I'll go back to Winston Churchill.
It's his night, and Brian and I can talk about this. So.
All right, thank all of you for your participation. If you could please join me in giving a warm thanks. Thank you for coming, and I hope that you will join us for a wine and cheese reception right outside.